All right, go for it. Cheryl,
Okay, I have chosen this video to call into question, have we fallen into a bias of using the 5-week structure as we have our program as our deload process, or are we actually implementing other variations and thinking more reactively to situations that might need to deload?
Okay, the phrase call into question did feel like this is like a legal thing.
It is.
Quite intense. Do you want to take the lead and we'll just kind of people jump in? How do you want to run it?
Okay, so the questions that I put forward were, would it ever be beneficial to an athlete to program a deload slightly differently than we do now? So if you watched the video, which I'm hoping you all did, it discussed 3 key ways there, which were the full week off, the taper week, and the standard deload. So I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on each of those. Anyone? Don't be shy. The full week off, what do we feel about literally going to our athletes? Right, athletes are a bit knackered. Take a week off.
So I think.
Sorry.
I think with the type of deloads, we can look at sort of the position the athlete's in, from a physical but also psychological standpoint. So, for example, if you've got an athlete that has worked incredibly hard for a competition, you might say, look, you can have a week off after, so you have a 4D load week after the competition, whether they would like to be programmed or not. So I think the big element is looking at the position an athlete is in.
Yeah, so similar to Adam, I also thought it's a good idea to have the full week off after competition. Obviously, people can go in and have a play if they want to, but if they feel like they need to take a week off training and they want to have a week off training, then is a really good time to have it. Also, if they have holidays planned, and then obviously that can be programmed in. We've got the calendar within our program template just so we can plan for that week off if they're wanting to take some time off for a holiday.
I think there's 2 important things there of like what the framing of a week off actually means. And is it a week off training or is it a week off program? And so like there is, I think the psychology, a lot of this falls into psychology more than it plays into real concerns about like the follow-up video that I sent through about talking about really the likelihood you're seeing drastic CNS fatigue is not that high, but what people are seeing in motivation and lifestyle might be more a concern. And so saying to someone like, okay, flat out, don't go to the gym is probably going to be very low on the priority list. But if it's a case, for instance, post-competition of being like, look, this has been mentally draining, do you want a fucking breather? That's a very different scenario to being like, do you want to just go to the gym and play? Because there's this experimental potential to it. So a full week off, I'm not normally an advocate for in terms of what it does for programming, but substantially more so for what it does for psychology of the lifter.
I'm in agreement. I put post-comp as my main reason. I would just say to someone, if they actually wanted to just not go to the gym for a week, they were literally exhausted and just like, I need to take a break. That's the one time I would say, take a week off and we kick back off in 7 days.
I think there's also like degree of travel, like, so because obviously we're saying an absolute a week off, as opposed to what if it was like, okay, take 50% of the week. And we're calling that like, obviously it's still putting under the title of a deload, but really I have a lifter who's traveling to America. I don't want you rushing to get to the gym. Between all that travel, the likelihood of that being successful is very low. There's a couple of sessions there that might be of some degree of benefit, and that's effectively being deloaded. But I think lifestyle plays into it in a very big way as well. If they have big life plans that are going on, or someone's moving house, for instance, and have to move their training forward.
Any other opinions on the week off?
So I used to take a week off before a comp. That was something that, like, before joining DBD, that was my standard. I just wouldn't go to the gym basically for a week. And that anticipation of like building into a competition, I was like eager to be back, eager to actually train again because I'd had that week off. I kind of had that restriction. Having had the opposite, an actual taper week into it, I don't think I would revert. I don't think I could possibly go back to having a week off before a full comp. Like, it's something we used to talk about in the gym all the time. Like, don't you always think that you've forgotten how to squat after a week? And then what you're expected to remember on the day that you compete on. So although I think in terms of like recovery, that was it, like they talked about in the video in terms of like recovery I think the taper week or the technical week, I've contradicted, I don't want to argue with that. I think that actually has worked better for me. This is the first time post nationals that I've actually been to the gym in that week off. And that's had massive benefits in me coming back into training, because I haven't had that week off DOMS. Like, I've actually got over the kind of slump or the post comp blues a lot quicker than I have previously. So actually, from just my last kind of like 2 weeks of life, I don't want to ever take another week off. Like, obviously, unless like you're going on holiday, you know, you're actually enjoying your life, but post comp, I would actually now, from this past 2 weeks, say you need to go back in for something like unprogrammed, but mentally now I need to go back earlier.
The archaic thing, which I'm sure at some point we all did when we started like lifting, and actually some people dodged it and you're fucking lucky, but you first do a competition, you're told, do you practice your openers on like the Monday and then you take the week off? And the principle is like, that's super compensation. You're going to be so overly recovered. You've never been so fucking recovered in your life. And then you get to comp and you're like, I squatted my opener unbelievably badly. And I think that like is a bit of an outdated model, but that's probably where most people's understanding of a deload actually started, because they didn't do it in cycle of training. They did it at comp week.
Yeah, that was the same as Lucy. Like, my previous experience was you had the week off, and it always confused me as well, but it was like, no, you'll be well rested. And I was just like, okay. And it's only when I came to DBD and understood the concept of them being also a little bit unskilled and a little bit scared by that point, I was just like, this made no sense whatsoever. And if anything, it just took me mentally out of the game, like Lucy said. So when it came to comp day, I felt awful.
What about the idea of a highly skilled super heavyweight lifter who is lifting 300-400 kilos, squat or deadlift? Like, where do we feel that sits into play with that? So say like a week off before they comp, because they need that objective recovery. What's people's thoughts on that? Because I don't think any of us coach anyone of that description, but there are athletes out there like that.
Is this something you've actually seen, Ryan, like while you're asking the question, or like are you just throwing it out there?
No, I've seen it a few times, and I'm sure I've listened to some podcasts of some world-class lifters do it because of the amount of objective load that they're lifting. They need more than a week to recover, and sometimes because they are quite highly skilled, they will just take a week off going into comp. And I would like to know what your thoughts are with that, if anyone has coached anyone of said description. Because I haven't. So
I've not done it, but I think I've seen the same resources that Ryan has in terms of this being the case, and it comes, from my opinion, it comes down to the history of the taper and the history of powerlifting, where it kind of started with a bunch of Americans, very large Americans, lifting a very large amount of weight in something between what we have now as raw powerlifting and equipped powerlifting. Somewhere in between is where it all started. So the idea of a week off, due to those reasons, is where it started, and then everyone just started doing it like, oh well, they do it and they're really strong. So it's knowing where to apply these things and the reasons for it, because you're right. If you're able to squat 400 kilos, you probably don't want to have your last heavy exposure that close to competition, because you do need the time to recover. But can you still do stuff in between? Possibly. And it's what the person needs. And that's where maybe trialing some taper strategies throughout your training cycle before comp's useful, so you can figure out which one it is. Test if you need more time off before. Like, I think I do quite well with 2 days off before, but I never really take 2 days off training. Well, I never used to. I used to do like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. And then I went into Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. So I did have the 2 days off. Sometimes I've tried 1 day off before comp. I think the last 2 comps I may have trained the day before, and it's not gone terribly. So like testing those things out are quite useful, but understanding why you're changing something and for what reason. Because if someone does lift an objectively ridiculous amount of weight, their last heavy exposure, maybe, I think a lot of us do, let's say it's a 5-week block, comps on week 5, so that's your taper week. Week 4 would be where we probably put our last heavy exposures. Well, if someone's going to squat 400, maybe their last heavy exposure is week 3. They have a medium exposure week 4, taper into week 5. Like, you just shift it back so they still have their recovery.
That's the bit I was going to ask on, because a lot of what we're talking about of like what a taper week is on the assumption of the week prior being that peak week, that top end. And so, like, let's say that it's the squat we're referring to, which, let's say, typically like 10 days out from competition is their top one. Is that person squatting 400 kilos? Is that 14 days out? Is it like, so maybe they don't need a week off, but you need an extended taper of that movement.
Yeah.
I'd love to fucking see it. Like, I'd love to see what Jesus Oliveira's his 4 weeks into Sheffield looks like. Is it that his top squat he hits is actually the block prior, and then he runs the principal up into it and then tapers early? Because that recovery structure I would expect to look quite different. I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't hit any peak squat within the block of the actual competition.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see like just how they always structure their workouts and their recovery and their tapers.
I want to know. We'll get Sneeter on. I'll shoot her a message.
Okay, anyone else on this one? Or talking of taper weeks, so the video also discussed using a kind of taper week, but outside of the prep process, basically. So looking at reducing volume whilst maintaining intensity during a block. So does anyone do this? Has anyone tried this, considered this? Anyone?
If I have an athlete going for, like, I've got Jenna, for example, who is aiming for a 200 kilo deadlift. It's not in competition or anything like that. It's just a very, very specific session that we're working towards. We'll probably do a soft-ish taper before that, just to make sure that she's feeling her best for that specific session. Even though it's not like a competition, it's just her deadlift. We will be peaking as such. I will be tapering her ever so slightly before that, just to make sure that she's not carrying any fatigue to affect that session.
So just the singular day, you would treat that basically like you were running it up into a taper before. And
Yeah.
we do that sort of like up to a heavyish single, give her a week off, and then back into a heavier single, or?
So I'll be tapering. So I'm not actually going to give her deadlift that session a taper. I'll be tapering the sessions around it. So yeah, we are just building this deadlift. I'm not giving her a whole week off or a whole taper week. It's just tapering all of her other sessions around it for that heavy deadlift.
Nice.
Yeah, I also do something similar if I have an athlete that's in like a long off season and we're just trying to establish where the baseline has gone. I would do a similar taper like that too.
I'd probably just deconstruct the word deload, decrease load. But what is load? Like, the first thing people think of is load on the bar, but the thing to probably draw your attention to is training load. So how many different ways can we reduce training load? We can reduce frequency. We can take a whole day out. That's a kind of a deload. We can reduce intensity, so load on the bar, or relative intensity, percentage of 1 rep max. We can reduce volume. Like, all of these 3 things can be manipulated to create a deload or a taper. We just use the word taper as in a deload before comp. That's all that is. A deload between blocks. We call it a deload. Like, it's just a name, but the process is exactly the same. So what are you trying to do? If you're trying to reduce peripheral fatigue, probably reduce the volume. If you're trying to reduce central fatigue, probably reduce the intensity. You could reduce a whole session, a bit of both. So yeah, I'd say manipulating intensity is something that I've done quite a bit. Volume. Recently, I've reduced volume the week before, so the last week of a block, going into the next one. So it's like, we can still keep intensity high because I'm also trying to drive strength. That's one of the drivers for strength is intensity. If I don't have you train high intensity, you're not going to get the adaptation that you want. if we're trying to grow them bigger and I take away their volume? Well, why? But I might take away their intensity. That's not going to help the deload week between blocks.
So I wanted to poke at like the idea of like how long the time frame has to be, because I literally had a call with Lucy just before this. We were talking about effective like a strategy of deloading each session to kind of get a point outcome. So whether it's, if we looked at like having ascending triples and you have 3 of them or 4 of them, whatever the fuck it is, and then each week, if you were to reduce the number of triples, you are deloading the amount of total volume being run, allowing for an increase of the relative intensity. So it depends on the framing of what we're talking about, but like, and then you can push the pinnacle session with no ascending sets, and then you get a forced outcome there with heightened recovery. Though the relative intensity has gone up, the total volume's gone down. What we can do is we see a similar thing, like we've probably all seen similar of go, let's say your squat priority is day 1, your deadlift priority is day 2. You do that top week of a block. Your secondary squat and your secondary deadlift, you effectively may well deload both of those. You might not even do the secondary deadlift. And so though it's not a full deload in principle, as Beck says, transition to the next block, you have begun a deload process to reduce like any of those things that really weren't going to be positive contributions anymore. Most of the time they were supportive of the primary thing that you have just delivered the results of. So you might end up having the second half of a week be a form of deload to then get into the next block with minimal excess fatigue. And within the things, again, there, just make sure that we're keeping the definitions right of when we're talking around fatigue. We're not just talking about, as you say, CNS fatigue, but like if it's joints, if it's ligaments, if we're getting things that are going to lead to other problems as we get into the next cycle of training. So it's just prioritizing where you needed to drop some of that intensity or volume and what result you're trying to get. And it doesn't have to be one given week. You can be doing that over a series of weeks.
Yeah, I agree. I've been sort of like kind of reactively doing the same thing, looking at where the data is going and then sort of reducing towards the end of the block, and that's been having some pretty good outcomes. So the third one was looking at what we consider to be, well, the standard deload, as Beck said. A deload is a deload, but your approach to it is slightly different. And I would say what he described as the standard deload is what we would consider to be our week 1, or typically our week 1, or even when you're starting out programming and you're new to the concept of a deload, our week 1 would look something like that. It's usually our lightest week, not always, because sometimes we do run into like a 6th week, a 7th week, depending on what the aim is and what we're looking at. But is anyone else sort of currently proactively relying on a standard deload week? So you're just like, it's always in week 1 and that works, or why?
Well, what you're describing is wave loading, reducing a little bit of volume going into week 1. Objective load is going to decrease anyway, because like if you're programming an RP, that's going to come down to the start of week 1, and then you build up, and then you go into the following block, which is week 1. You drop a little bit of volume to an extent, but you still carry on the same skill set going into that next block. So essentially all that is wave loading. I don't know if I'd call that a full deload per se. If I was to define a deload week, it would be if you have 5 weeks, you have a 4-week build up, and that 5th week is a complete drop down of either volume and or intensity, and then you go into next week. So I think it's just a little bit of a definition. Like I call it wave loading. I wouldn't call that a full deload.
No, that's fair enough. I just wondered if anyone was using that week 1 similarly to like a full deload, depending on how they are programming it. Because we always see week 1 as the recovery week, the easy week, however you're viewing it.
I think a lot of new strategies in programming typically mean that rather than effectively what becomes a regurgitated week 1 ran as a deload, to finish off that block with the exact same principle, deloaded, reduced intensity or load, whatever load or volume. Rather than just reiterating that, most programming kind of escapes it with this principle of introducing the new block substantially softer. So you're getting that heightened recovery, even if that new block has little changes to it, even if the volume ends up being higher in places, the intensity is so much lower that you're getting some format of that deload anyway. So I think that's where most coaches have escaped using a deload in traditional sense and just used it a transitional phase, and that's why blocks now run softer. I do see some programming more towards like emerging strategies where week 1 is already at a more substantial intensity. They'll start like just taking off an RPE. Week 1's already at an RP 7, maybe even an RP 8, which I saw last week and genuinely surprised the shit out of me. But they will then more likely use a deload because they're going to begin the block at a higher point. A lot more block structure now has whatever rate of ramping, and so there's going to be less need for a traditional deload.
Hey, now make sure you use the right word if you're going to use emerging strategies. They do pivots. They don't like the word deload. They just put a random 2 weeks in there of just nonsense and then go, yeah, you're recovered.
Do they use them in like genuinely pivot instead of, because I see the like the pivot of being, here's some crazy fucking shit that has nothing to do with your training, but they only lean towards pivot, not deload, because I don't pay as much attention as I used to.
I mean, I think if done properly, like from the guys at RTS, I imagine there is a real thought process behind it. But I think a lot of the coaches who think they understand emerging strategies, who have seen like 3 videos on YouTube about it, and they just go, oh yeah, I understand now. We run the same thing every single week for 9 to 90 weeks. We track the response, or what responder type are you? And then we go, oh, okay, well, I've run you into the ground because we've done the same thing for too long. Here's some random bullshit while I come up with your real program. Like, I think that's what happens a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Well,
I still see that programming, and it still surprises me that it doesn't get kickback. Of course we're doing 9 sets of front squat. It's a pivot week. Why would we not?
yeah, it's like, we actually want to turn you into an Olympic weightlifter now. So do some clean and jerk and snatches for 2 weeks and snatch grip RDLs with dumbbells for somehow. Like,
I want a pivot week, guys. What was the other frame of a deload that we didn't talk about yet?
That was it. That was 3. That was
So one of the things we haven't spoken about, which is in the other one, is like reactive deloads in terms of injury management or like injury prevention. And this is one I think people are really like stopped taking the same principle. Is it's really easy to do when you get some form of irritation, right? Someone's benching and you go like, okay, we're getting some form of overuse injury, or at least within that, the assumption that it might be that they're getting a shoulder injury. And so we start to manage volume almost immediately. And effectively, you're just running a reactive deload. The problem is that it doesn't frame the same way, because it's not like, oh, we're going to, for next week, we're going to reduce and then we're going to bring up again. It ends up being like a shift in the model where you go, okay, we're going to bring the volume down, see how you respond, see if we can get the response out of this still to reduce the chance of coming back into a chronic cycle. And I won't nerd about it for too long, but I think deloads as injury management don't sit anywhere traditionally, because it's not done end of block. Let's just make sure that it's obviously one of the means for doing it, but it can end up being mid block of being like, we had an idea that we'd get more volume here, but your adductor's blown out your asshole, and so we can't continue it. And so you end up with some sort of in block management, and it might be that you can mitigate it enough to continue what you were doing, or you might have to then go full shift in protocol.
I mean, we can continue talking about this because it does provide different issues. If you've like scheduled out or pre-periodized your training into a competition, injury pops up, and like you say, it doesn't come across as the deloads we've spoken about. It comes across as a shift in protocol. So let's say you've done 2 of the 5 weeks that you planned, right? Week 3, we've now got issues. Week 3, we've changed. Oh, but now we're building momentum from week 3, week 4, week 5. But you were going to stop on week 5. Do you still stop? Or now you're kind of stuck in like, oh, but I should probably go up to week 7 because we've restarted the block pretty much. And that's happened to me. I think the last block I did 7 weeks, and it was mental. I was like, I'm ruined, but I just kept getting a little bit stronger. And it's like, nah, okay, we do have a schedule to keep to. We've got 12 weeks out. Right, we're going to do something else now. And he was like, I kind of want to do an extra week, but is it worth pushing when you're 12 weeks out? Probably not. So like, start the new block after that. But it's, how one of the original questions was, are we sitting in the bias of the fact that our spreadsheet just has 5 weeks in the block? We can go, it's easy to go down to 4. We just don't use the 5th one. But how willing are we to extend it and do 6, 7 weeks if needed in these pretty unusual situations? Like, it's not that common that we've changed mid-block to something to accommodate.
I think there's this is the nuance of where like block length and cycle length and stuff, like, so we're talking about, do we fall into the bias in the program? I personally would say no, because I often disregard where it is, whether like I'm on week 1, I'm like, you're fucking not, it's week 4. But it's a disregard for what that structure looks like. The really hard thing is, so you're within a certain time frame, which justifies a lot of decisions, but I think a lot of those decisions on protocol can't be done too much in advance once you're at that point. So you can get to, let's say, injury arises, or just say irritation arises at week 2, shift in protocol. You're not then going to forward plan 4 weeks. You're going to assume potential for it and allow for it, but then it becomes much more hands-on week on week of review. And you can't, like, that's where it has to be. Like, block structure just doesn't work the same way, where you have to go like, okay, it could go this way, but it could mean that we're going to have to cut this in 2 weeks. And I think it allows for, well, it forces your hand to be a lot more hands-on with those decisions as you go.
I also, so of the proactive and reactive sort of deloading from watching the video, sort of, and Ryan, something we've spoken about, it's like that choice to ride momentum versus like, do we call it here? Like, what are the benefits of keeping this going? Like, you know, in terms of things like data collection, versus like, are we just running the risk of an injury? So like over, you know, fatigue management and stuff like that as well. So sometimes like having that proactive deload, we know that we're going to be safer and the athlete's going to recover, but also are we sort of missing out on some opportunities there as well? So it's like proactive versus deactive in that sense.
The big thing I would add in there is like, so data collection versus pattern trends. So like you can create patterns with very little need for deload, because the pattern's like relatively simplistic, doesn't require too high of an intensity most of the time to get a rough idea. That can be any point of a cycle. Real data of response to our most simplistic output, what does it do to our singles? I think that's probably when you can proactively plan the deload. Like, okay, we're going to run effectively a testing phase. You can assume the deload is going to be after that. If you're like, we're running 3s and 4s and we're not going to hit higher than like an RP7 or an RF3, then you can say we might not even need to deload because we're not going to run to that intensity. So I think pattern trends in training require less proactive deloads. Whereas like real data collection probably means you can proactively program them. And then general cycle training, I would assume more towards reactive deloads. As a real generalized statement.
Any other thoughts on that, sort of like around testing how far the block goes to use more reactive deloading?
The octopus wants to say.
The octopus wants to talk. It's got its...
Keeps giving Ryan and Alice dirty fucking looks. It's magic.
That's exactly why I chose the octopus. Just
on his way out, like
throw shade to everyone. Yeah, like I think it comes to my favorite quote of like where you are in the block. You know, you're 12 weeks out. Probably not going to risk the idea of like, oh, let's just see where this first block goes, because you're probably going to end up with put yourself in a sticky situation where if their time to peak doesn't quite match up, because I do believe you can manipulate time to peak in certain situations. Like if I give you a really easy protocol, you won't peak for ages. If I give you a more intense one, you'll probably peak a bit sooner. Like you can only handle that stimulus for so long. The other thing to think about is, has anybody looked at the average strength increases for most powerlifters over a year?
Is this what went out publicly on Instagram the other day?
Oh, I don't know if I saw it on Instagram. I saw it maybe like 5-6 years ago. There was like a meta-analysis of just like obviously a bunch of powerlifters, and they tested how strong they got periodically, and it was like on average you get about 0.5 kilo stronger a week on average. Like this varied massively from beginner to advanced, but still, like most gyms don't have 0.5 kilo plates. Most equations aren't accurate enough to pick up 0.5 kilo. So when we're all sat here like, oh yeah, this data's trending really nicely, they're getting really strong, or are they just being able to express their strength really well? And that's the thing that you're manipulating / working on, rather than that actually getting stronger, because at a rate of about 0.5 kilo a week, the measurements for that, we don't have any tools right now, or we don't use any that are accurate enough. So to truly say, yeah, you're you're struggling, or like I'm getting stronger, I'm getting weaker. Like it's very difficult to objectively say.
I mean, two things. I haven't gotten half a kilo a week stronger in 3 years, so that's not fucking close to true.
Must have been an outlier.
I'm the negative one. The other thing is they did put that out because someone was talking about, it was literally last week, they're talking about women's bench specifically, because they're saying like, if you get an order rate of progress, look how it correlates specifically to bench. Because I think that there's a discrepancy of that half kilo across obviously different lifts. But yeah, the same thing of like what that rate means. But exactly what you're saying is you're asking the question, are you testing? And you're at a point, you're just forcing someone to display strength. And in that principle, that's probably the timing that you can proactively assume your deload, because you are forcing demonstration. And at that point where you're just kind of doing constructive building work over time, there's very little there's less of a need for a proactive deload. Trying to tie it back to the question because I'll get carried away.
Callum, you also touched on like not needing a deload or not using a deload. Like, so the video also discussed that and said, are there any instances where we would say someone doesn't need a deload? And I feel like that's quite a big question, because like in terms of training, shouldn't people rest at some point? Or
there's a massive assumption of training age and so their absolute strength, right? Like if you give me someone who's like, I'm going to try powerlifting, I can guarantee I can do moderate dose, moderate intensity training for probably minimum 12 weeks and still see continual development with no need for a deload. If it's someone where you're looking for a response and say you've assumed there's some sort of individual difference that they respond really well to high volume, then you may have to assume one because your tendons and ligaments still don't like that level of overuse. If there's someone of an absolute strength, like who is training age 3+ years, there is still probably going to be more of a need. But in short, a newbie, much less so, to the extent that like not for an extended period of time, which is probably my bias.
I agree.
Would you ever program someone into a comp without a taper? So like, say their opener is an 8, would you program them like the normal, obviously, like you're not going to go crazy with the volume, but would you program them like a 7.5 the week before? Or would you always now taper someone into a competition?
I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to say, Beck, you're nodding and you rarely move. So
Yeah, I think it very much challenges the idea of tapering and stuff. Like, it's a good question. And if you want to know more about it, like the emerging strategies philosophy of like going into a competition is exactly that, where you will just train like normal and comp day is comp day. Like you can only do as well as you can on that day. And we'll just, hopefully it lands on your peak week, like your time to peak. But if not, like it's as strong as you could be on that day. So it is there are many people that will just train into it. They don't really put any form of deload in front of it or taper. They just go like, cool, we've got a comp on week 4. Well, week 3 will be an RPE 8 because on week 4 you're going to do RPE 9.5, 10. Like that's the next thing that you would normally do anyway. Week 2 is probably, I don't know, like 6s. Week 1's 5s, for example. So 5, 6, 7, 8, or 5, 6, 9, 10, whatever it may be. It's definitely something to play with for some people. I think where we said on Brian's question of what about a massive person with a huge total may need a bit of a longer taper, you then come up with a great question there of what about a shorter taper or no taper? Who may that suit? Potentially lighter weight, lower absolute strength athletes.
I don't want to add much to that. That's pretty small.
I'm pretty sure my first comp, I don't think I had a taper, but I did sign up to it like 3 weeks before. So we just sort of ran straight into it. But I was such a new lifter. Like, it was fine.
I think no different from a lot of what we do in. So let's say we're writing a taper now, the assumption is like, let's keep most of the variables because we knew they worked. And so we're making a new assumption that to reduce those variables will heighten output. So like we're still making an assumption. We try to lean away from as many of them as possible of being like, let's not subtract these working sets, these accessories, because these may well have contributed. And that's the only assumption we have because we've never done that before. And so in theory, if you just push that to extreme, we have no reason to not do anything. Like of any of the stuff we did of like relative intensity, we have no reason to remove that. And we are leaning to the assumption that there will be a better outcome. An example that is the least tapered for like somewhat objectively female bench with a moderate training age, let's just say someone around 57 kilos benches around 65 kilos, probably looks like the lowest form of taper for me, like probably doesn't shift too much from the norm in training. Whereas anyone towards the peripheral, more training age, more absolute strength, probably I would lean towards the assumption that need more recovery. I think I would just be too nervous that if someone goes and they did an RPA the week before, they go in and they're like, I feel gassed. I just lean towards the bias, but it's definitely a bias because, like you said, sorry, like Beck says, entire groups of people would literally just program you straight through.
Kind of goes hand in hand with what Lucy said about sort of like when she had that week off before and she just felt a bit like deflated and she was just kind of like, I've been out of training for a week, versus like being in training and feeling actually just really hyped for it. That's where it could go really, really well. Like your training's going great, you hit an RP8 single and you're thinking, I cannot wait for comp. Okay, well, it's the next week. So that's maybe when it could run really well to not do a taper.
I'll give you an example where you see it in practice. Someone who maxes out their deadlift a week after competition hits a new PB.
Yeah.
Like they didn't actually have a deload because they just competed. They pulled something at a moderate to high intensity and then they go into the gym and they do it again. And you're like, shouldn't really have happened. There's obviously questions there about what really the productivity of the taper was in the first place in the whole fucking block structure. But in principle, you're still seeing the same thing, which makes us all look silly.
That was all my questions. So does anyone else have anything they'd like to add?
Yeah, I want to argue with the technical week instead of calling it a taper, because in my head, that makes me overthink everything that I'm focusing on. So like I'm a week out of comp, you don't necessarily give me a taper, you give me technical practice where I overthink everything about my squat depth, which obviously I do need to overthink. My deadlift, my bench, my elbow depth, all that kind of thing. So that is something that I would not want to have introduced to me. But again, that might be a controversial opinion.
I did actually write this down, like what do we think about the phrase technique week? So Lucy hates it. Anyone else?
If you're a week out from comp and you technique week, you don't fuck with it.
But I understand why they've given it that, but I'm just like it. I feel like it complicates things as well. Mentally, I don't like it.
There's a time and a place, like definitely not before competition, but yeah, there might be places where you might want to program it, but it should be something that's just dealt with throughout programming, not the week before competition.
And video analysis and stuff like that, that's where we do our technical feedback. Like it should be, like you said, an ongoing process, a development constantly.
Yeah. I think like in essence, you might keep elements that are technically reinforcing, like so why you keep your variations or any of the secondary or tertiary days that are reinforcing the thing for the platform. But that was the point, the entire fucking block. It doesn't become more the point 1 week out. And I really think if you're saying to a lifter, like, right, it's technique week, let's make sure we're squatting to depth, should have done that. A week out, then like you really put someone in a shit situation, but you had to figure that out in the week of competition.
Mm-hmm.
I think I like the term technique week for a deload week and not necessarily the taper week.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about like from a deload week, it's week 1 of a block. That's when you're getting new focus points, new technique adjustments. So I think if it's better there on a deload week and not necessarily the taper week, because like Lucy said, you are going to start to overthink everything.
It's like Beck's favorite phrase, isn't it? Like, have we got time to do it? Have we got time to overthink this and potentially think, no, don't like that, didn't work? Then, you know, we can just do a U-turn on that, but not out from comp.
I would like to know what Beck's favorite phrase really is, because I saw his face go, is this my favorite phrase?
He did say that. I'm sure he said that, and this is recorded. So
all the time. Favorite phrase is, I know I'm allergic to it, but I do love cheesecake.
Yeah. That's what I say to all of the waitresses and waiters. But then in terms of my opinion of like the names of things, right? I think ultimately everyone wants to put their own name on something to be like, oh, it's different. Pisses me off. And then like the opinions from the group seem to be your athlete perspective on the name rather than your coaching perspective on the name. I'm pretty sure you can all appreciate the coaching perspective, and that's why. Like, you all understand, oh, they call it technique week because the primary focus of that week is to reinforce technique potentially. Like, we established that when Lucy takes a whole week off, she feels underskilled. So the reason to keep it there, technique or skill week. But then, yeah, athlete psychology is everyone's freaking out because now it's like, oh, I've got to focus on my technique. So the thing, like, the way people should be naming things could be based on the athlete in front of them and their psychology. Because I think some athletes will be like, oh yeah, technique week, like things are easy. Like, their perspective might not be on enhancing their focus on technique. It could be the retraction of the other things. Deload, many athletes are like, oh, it's easy, you don't have to try. No, you still have to try. You still have to do this properly. You can't just walk in, not do any warm-ups and bench like your working set. So, like, just name it whatever you want. Maybe just have a different name for each athlete. Like, TSGs use like, oh, this is a build week, this is an attack week, this is a recovery week. I'm like, all right, you just made up fancy names. Someone else uses like intensification, recovery, development, intro. I've seen less coaches use blocks now, and you see people posting like, yeah, week 17. I'm like, surely that's not the same block. Like, yeah, it's just week 17 of my program. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, is it some sort of like distraction technique for the athlete? Like, so they don't know when their deload's coming. Ooh. I just don't like the people naming shit. Going to school and just being like, oh, so this is the name for it. Yeah, but this person calls it something else. Why? It's the same thing. I know. So why isn't it just the same name? Oh, because you want it to sound smart.
The only one that is an original name is Pivot Week, which is only other known as like absolute fuckery. There is no one else does that shit. See. I had a list of just a couple of bits that we don't have to dive into, but considerations for deload, because I was writing a shit ton of notes. But that you can use it to aid unfit timeframes for competition. Someone joins competition late where you have to shift protocol and you have to change what you're planning to do. You might reactively then put one in. If planned in advance, it's no different from holiday from work. Of like, if people already know they're going on holiday for a certain week, you proactively program it way in advance, and you might then structure around it. You might not have to. Using to align with life stressors. Also a psychological burnout. So like, if someone is witnessing just like, in the same way you'll see hyper response to pain with nerve symptoms, you can see hyper response to emotions with lifters, where it's like they're having hard sessions and emotional response is heightened. You might actually consider, just from a psychological standpoint, a deload to reduce the stress, because they're not in a position where they're clearly heightened, whether that's external or actually from the training itself. The most likely, like if you're using a deload and you want to impact things that are like tendons, ligaments, and so on, you're most likely going to be doing that through volume as opposed to actual intensity. And then people talking about CNS fatigue is mostly fucking nonsense, because real CNS fatigue does look like, is it rhabdo and death? So it's hard to fucking do. They were just my short notes. We have to jump into it.
Could we also go over the idea of, when we talk about deloads, we don't have to deload everything at the same time? So like bench is the obvious one, but we can carry bench through without the need of a deload quite often, whereas we would have to deload squat or deadlift alongside. Do anyone do that, or does, when people apply a deload or a taper, whatever you want to call it, like, do you do all three, or do you pick and choose what you taper, or how much do you taper? Like, what do other people do?
What, like throughout, like throughout a regular block, like sort of just looking at how things are running?
Yeah,
and then
let's say a 12 block, for example.
I guess again, I'd be looking at their response to what I'd given them, and am I going to sort of reactively deload around that? And I have actually found that, yeah, it does happen at different rates. So I'm just like, actually, I'm going to need to sort of pull that back a little bit if I want that to sort of, in the next block, I'm planning this to happen. So I'm actually going to have to, what is funny? What have you done? Why are you all muted?
I was saying, did you not notice that Beck disappeared under the sea?
Oh no, I didn't. Bye back. Yeah, that's it. In short, basically, it has happened for me, and I've just sort of been reactive to it as the situation has occurred.
I was just going to add that effectively it depends on what you did with the lift. If you have a block that, let's just say, the squat's running more towards a volume, is developmental or skill application, depending on the person, but the deadlift has been trending well and you've actually been pushing that, then I might deload the deadlift and not the squat. If it's where, in theory, there is going to be peripheral fatigue that's related between one and the other, so like they low bar squatter, there's going to be a relatively large amount of lower back fatigue, for instance, then I might make the assumption I'll reduce them both and deload them both because they may need them equally, but it's not necessarily going to mean that the bench does. If like bench might, squat and deadlift might not, deadlift and squat might not, bench might.
Yeah, I'd also lean in. I don't know if it's a bias, and maybe I would just be like, as the squat's getting heavier, do I need to sort of back off on the deadlift and stuff like that, just to decrease that fatigue? But would that also sort of lean into what kind of squatter they are as well, and what sort of, oh my god, I give up. If they've got, you know, they're more sort of hip dominant as a low bar squatter and stuff like that, would that be something you'd need to back off when you're considering like a conventional deadlift? I hate you both so much.
I love that we've handled this one beautifully, but I think this one being Beck's last call, that this is probably the best sign-off possible. Does anyone have anything really specific they want to cover, or can we wrap this up?
I think we're done. Bye, Beck.
With this being the last call, obviously, first of all, Alice, please take a photo, because we will forget. And this is the last call we have Beck on. If you are ever keen again, and it's a subject you actually want to chat about, we'd love to have you on, which would be as a guest, which is fucking weird. But just with everyone else here, I just want to say thank you. This is not only in these conversations, the amount that you've contributed to, but you know what DBD was like before any of these fuckers were here in the first place. And what it's been. So a thank you from me, and we'll be sad to see you leave, but best of luck. It'll be fucking amazing. Or it better be.
Thanks. How much do I get paid for guest appearances? And I was here before all of you, so don't fuck this up.
Guest appearances, £12.50, but there's no octopus. See you in 2027. Done.
At least it's minimum wage.
Just. Thank you guys. Thank you, Beck. Look after yourself. I'm sure I'll speak to you probably in the next few days anyway.
Bye. I'll probably see you anyway, Ryan, but bye.
Bye.
Bye. Forever. Bye.
Forever goodbye.